All right, so we will get started. We would like to welcome Heather Zinn Brooks to our Colloquium series. Heather, you've already kind of told what I was able to scour your website with. So you got your bachelor's and PhD in math at the University of Utah, and then you did a postdoc in the math department at UCLA. And so today she's going to talk to us about social networking.
Yeah, models opinion dynamics on networks. Yeah, not social networking. This is a different challenge. I'm not sure I'm qualified on that front. All right, let me see if I might need permissions to get the screen share going.
You should be able to screen share.
Aha, okay. Get that up and running. All right, are we seeing that okay? Everyone can hear me? Good. All right, then let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for the introduction, and I really appreciate it. I'm grateful for the opportunity to come and visit you all virtually today. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's exciting to be able to connect. So y'all already got a little bit of a sense of my background, but just to give you a little bit more about what I'm interested in, what I like to do, and what brought me to thinking about these kinds of problems of opinion dynamics. As I mentioned briefly, I actually had my training primarily in mathematical biology. So that was at University of Utah. And back then I was thinking a lot about problems in pattern formation and intracellular transport. Still love these kinds of problems, but being involved with this math biology side of things, I ended up being introduced to and started to getting really interested in networks and specifically dynamical systems on networks. And so much of the work that I'm doing right now is in this networks space. And I do math modeling, both still in biological systems, but also have branched out into thinking about modeling human social systems also. So I got a wide variety of interests. And you can see on the left side, this is my briefest, broadest pitch that I can give for what me and my students here at Harvey Mudd do, which is I like to think that the main goal of all my work is to try to make as many connections as I can in complex systems where dynamics and structure are both involved. And networks is a wonderful space to work in. And today I'm going to tell you about a piece of my research program which I have been super excited about, which is opinion dynamics. And so I want to start off with a little bit of background on what we mean by mathematical models of opinion dynamics. How might you think about this sort of abstract social concept, opinion dynamics, and turn it into something that you could study mathematically? So that's where I'm going to start off today. So the idea, the goal behind this field of study is that we want to think about modeling the evolution of opinions of agents. So you can see on the screen, there's all these little characters. Imagine that's our folks in a population, could be in person, could be online, whatever setting you like. So each of those individuals in the language of complex systems, we call them agents. And we want to think about how their opinions change. And in order to think about that, I need to be able to have a strategy for quantifying opinions. So for the purpose of this talk, what I'm going to do is assume that perhaps we're just looking at opinions on one issue where we could think about perhaps a spectrum. So if you think about, I think a nice analogy would be maybe some issue on the political spectrum where you could think about a whole range of opinions from perhaps very conservative up to very liberal. Then what you could do is imagine that you could place the opinion of each of those individuals on somewhere on that spectrum. So that value, that opinion value, I can take as a real number, something from that interval, and we'll call that x sub I. So I've illustrated it in two ways on the slide here. One is with the little numbers that are above the heads of the people, but also with the color. So you can imagine yellow is very, very far to, say, the left of the spectrum, and all the way up to blue or teal being very far to the right. All right, so supposing that we can do that, and we could sort of quantify each of these agents' opinions, we might want to start thinking about how they could change over time, right? The evolution of the opinions is kind of the big exciting question that I'm really interested in. And so the main way we will study this is how opinions of these agents might change as a result of interactions with the other agents in the system. So I've now represented those interactions with little lines between each of these people. So those little black lines would represent interactions. So maybe that's something online, right? They could have some sort of online exchange, perhaps they're having a conversation, sort of any kind of abstract interaction that you like. And if you're in the mathematical space and you're starting to draw this picture, then you might think, aha, I can see a way that I could take this abstraction a little bit further. And so what I've done here is change my little characters into circles, which are nodes in the network, and then the relationships or the interactions between the nodes are encoded as edges. And so I have now a little nice abstract pictorial representation. And again, here the numbers and the colors, that's going to be the opinion value that each of that node has. So now I have an underlying network, which represents the interactions and the agents, and then the opinions of those agents sort of living on that network. All right, so now that we have a basic idea of how we could sort of make the abstraction of opinion dynamics to try to study it, the question is, but how do they evolve really? Like, how do opinions evolve on social networks? What are the interesting questions here? There's lots of different ways to study these questions. Many good ways, which I am not going to talk about today. So I think many folks are familiar with a lot of the more data-driven or computational methods, like a lot of really exciting work about people doing studies on Twitter and so on. That's not the realm that I'm living in. I am approaching this problem from a little bit of a different perspective, which is that I'm interested in studying the dynamics of simple models of evolutions of opinions with the goal of potentially understanding possible underlying mechanisms for opinion spread. And so the techniques I use is a combination of both mathematical analysis as well as numerical simulation. And I think it's not such a hard sell these days to say, in terms of the application, this is it's one of the really big problems I think that we have today is understanding how information is being spread and how information is being changed, especially with the advent of the connectivity we have in the online world. So lots of really exciting questions here. I'm sort of living in one little slice, which is thinking about dynamics and mathematical properties of simple models. So in particular, I have primarily been studying a particular class of opinion dynamics models, which now we're getting to what the title of the talk comes from, are called bounded confidence models. So bounded confidence models are built on two principles that come from sociological literature. And it's thinking about the behavior of individuals as they are trying to share opinions or come to consensus. So there's one body of sociological literature that suggests that individuals in small groups especially often feel pressure to move toward consensus. But on the other hand, we know perhaps from things we've observed in real life or online that it is not always the case that individuals are trying to move toward consensus all the time. But in fact, there are several great studies out there suggesting that folks are much more likely to adopt an opinion if it confirms or supports the biases that they already have. And so when you look at these two pieces of sociological literature, you sort of start to think like, well, it seems almost a little bit contradictory. Like, how can both of these things be true? Or how can we incorporate both of these things together? And that's exactly what the bounded confidence models are trying to do. It's a really simple model that incorporates these two ideas, that we want to move toward consensus, but maybe only if we sort of already agree with the idea, or if it's somehow confirming a bias that we already have. Just a little bit of motivation or perhaps background on why I think these models are so wonderful to study. First of all, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I am always really excited about any type of problem that involves the interplay of dynamics and structure. And in these models, it is so rich, right? Thinking about the networks and the dynamics on those networks, lots of room to play there. Just as a matter of personal preference, as a mathematician, I love simple models that have really surprisingly complicated dynamics. And as I hope I can sort of convince you today, this is definitely a case of that. Super rich dynamics, even in models that are quite simple to write down. From the perspective of doing research in this area, it's also, there's a lot of open questions. It's a really exciting area to work in. I love that it's interdisciplinary, both in the sense of thinking about problems outside of mathematics, but you can also actually pull techniques from a lot of different math subfields. So as someone who likes these kind of problems, I think it's really exciting. So to give a little bit more concreteness to how we might write down a model that incorporates these features, how we would write down these bounded confidence models, I'm going to show you first an example of a particular type of bounded confidence model. And this is known as in the literature is known as the Hegselmann-Krause model. So those are two individuals that sort of codified this particular class of bounded confidence model originally. And you can see at the top the kind of heuristic explanation of how this works, which is that we can imagine evolving time in discrete time steps. And then at each time step, every node is going to update by averaging the opinion states of their neighbors. That's a way to encode consensus in a very simple way. But then the second line is going to introduce the fact that we have some predilections toward our existing biases, that we're only going to average in the opinion states of our neighbors if they are sufficiently close to us in opinion space. And so here in this example, by sufficiently close, that means I'm going to just introduce a hard cutoff. This is called the confidence bound. That's where the name of these models come from. And here, let's just set the confidence bound to be 0.5. So I've got our abstracted network from before. And okay, let's evolve it and see how this works, just for a couple of steps. So to do the first update, I need to see all of the edges which are too far apart, right, where the opinions are more than 0.5 apart. And I'm going to disregard all of those for the moment. So that's what those red X's are. So all of the edges that remain, each of these nodes are going to then average their current opinion with the opinions of their neighbors. And there they go. So each of the nodes have been updated according to the rule. And so then at each time step, we repeat this, right? So now we need to see, okay, let's check again which ones are within the confidence bound or not, right? Ignore all the ones that aren't and continue the update. And so we can go, hopefully that gives you a sense of the idea how this, this discrete time dynamical system works, and you can keep evolving and start to ask questions about what happens. I think something that's really exciting to think about is what's going to happen if I keep evolving this system, right? Where are the opinion states going to end up? And this is in fact where a lot of the mathematical study has focused on these types of models. So to give you a sense of some questions of interest for people who study these models, we might want to ask, as I said, about the long time behavior. So if, again, just to remind us of the notation, we say x sub I is the opinion of node I at time t. And then we could start to ask, well, do the agents collectively, does each of their opinions reach some kind of stationary state? And so you can see on the right that we have an example where this happens, right? In fact, we say the model converges if, well, you can see the mathematical definition on the slide. I won't read it to you, right? As t goes to infinity, if each node ends up at some stationary state, we say the model converges. There's quite a bit of literature studying whether certain types of bounded confidence models converge. And if they do converge, we could ask, well, do we have to actually go to infinity, right? Do we only converge in the limit, or do these models actually converge in a finite number of steps? It turns out that for the Hegselmann-Krause model, in fact, this it's well known, this model converges in finite time, which is quite nice. So once you start to have some idea that this model converges, that there is a stationary behavior, then you might want to start asking questions about what it converges to, right? What kinds of opinion states do we get out at the end? And one particular area of, I guess one area of particular interest is whether or not the agents will reach a consensus. And so consensus is a special type of convergence where every agent, as t goes to infinity, ends up having the exact same opinion. So in the picture on the top, we have convergence, not consensus, right? We have two distinct opinion groups. On the bottom picture, we have consensus. Both of the agents have come to an agreement. So the question of convergence, as I said, is pretty well studied and well known. The question of consensus is actually still like kind of exciting, and there's some things that are known. There's lots of interesting things that aren't known. So to dig into these models a little bit more, or perhaps to make this a little more concrete, I think it's time for us to really actually introduce the mathematical notation for how we would write down these systems, so how you could actually study them. So quick intro for those who are not familiar with study of networks. So if we have a network, we fortunately have these wonderful mathematical objects, which we can use to encode networks. And that object is the graph. So graph is an object that it has two sets associated with it, the vertex set or the node set. So that's the set of all the agents, and the edge set, which is the set of all the edges connecting them. And there's several wonderful, convenient representations of graphs, but one that is particularly useful for my purposes is the adjacency matrix. So once we move into this sort of linear algebraic representation of graphs, then we have all of these wonderful tools at our disposal. So in the following slides, whenever you see A, that's going to represent the adjacency matrix. So that's a matrix that encodes the edges by putting a 1 in the ijth component of the matrix if I and j have an edge, and 0 otherwise. So wonderful. Now we have a matrix representation of our graph. And then I will encode the opinion states in a vector. So that's going to be bold X. That's all the opinion states. In order to do this, I need to introduce some labeling on my nodes. I can do that however I like, as long as I'm consistent. Great. So now that I have this representation, I could actually write down the equations for this, this discrete time system. So here's again a description of how this model works. And here's what the actual equations look like. So if you're not used to these kinds of models, this might at first glance look a little bit scary, but it's actually not too bad at all. If you look at the numerator, all this says is, if I'm node I, what I'm going to do is take my own opinion at the previous time step, and then I'm going to add up, okay, the opinions of all the other nodes, that's xj. I only want the ones I'm connected to, so then that multiplication by a, because a contains only the zeros and ones, gives me only my neighbors. So I'm adding up now the opinions of only my neighbors. The last little piece is this bold 1. That's representing an indicator function. So I also only want to include the ones whose distance in opinion space is less than that parameter. So that's that indicator function there. And that's it, right? So add up all those neighbors who are sufficiently close to me, and then the denominator is just normalized by the number of opinions that I'm doing, so that I'm in fact getting the average. That's it. Not so bad. Looks a little scary, but actually quite simple in structure. And so there's just one important parameter there, which is the confidence bound C. So you could start to ask, how does this interaction cutoff, or I like to think about this as a receptiveness, affect the sorts of dynamics that we see in long times? And I will give you just two specific examples on the next slide. you can imagine, I don't think it would surprise anybody if I told you that the larger that we make this, this parameter, right? The larger we make the receptiveness of the nodes, the easier it is to get consensus in these models. So what you'll see on the left, these are time series, so time on the horizontal axis, and then the opinions of each node are represented with one of the colorful lines on the vertical axis. So you can see on the top a consensus state where we eventually end up with all nodes at the same state. So it's represented, there's the actual graph on the right-hand side, color-coded with the opinions again. So contrast that with what's going on in the lower half of the slide, which is that we have a smaller receptiveness interval, smaller confidence bound, 0.2. And what we end up getting at convergence is opinion fragmentation, or sometimes this is called dissensus. So we actually have here a bunch of different opinion groups, right? So we have what looks like two sort of larger opinion groups, and then a few others that are smaller. You can see that a bit with the color coding in the network visualization as well. So really like interesting dependence on network structure, interesting dependence on the number of agents that you have, on your consensus parameter. So like some very exciting things to study there. Before I like kind of jump into my recent projects, I do want to introduce you. I've spent all this time talking about this Hegselmann-Krause model, and I mentioned like, well, this is only one type of bounded confidence model. I do want to introduce you to another type, just to give you a sense of what else is out there. This is the other most commonly studied type of bounded confidence model, which is called the Deffuant-Weisbuch model. Again, the two folks who worked on these models. And so if you look at this, you might think, well, Heather, that what you have on the slide looks exactly the same. But very subtle difference here. I'm going to assume now with this Deffuant-Weisbuch model that only one interaction happens at a time. So we call this an asynchronous update. So what's going to happen is at each time step, I will choose an edge. So you can choose this from some probability distribution on the edges. Let's say I've chosen this one between in the middle there. And then I do sort of a very similar process to what we saw in the Hegselmann-Krause model. So I check if it is within the cutoff, those two were, and so they average their opinions. And we can go on, right? We pick another edge here. I'm just doing it uniformly at random. Check if they're within confidence bound. Here they're not, so no update. And we carry on, right? Here's another one. They are within the confidence bound, they update. And we can carry on, right? And again, start to ask some of the similar types of questions. So now we can write down, also, this model is actually a little bit simpler to write down than the Hegselmann-Krause model because we only have to look at two nodes at any given time. You can start to see the similarities in structure with the Hegselmann-Krause model. Sometimes folks do introduce this extra parameter in Deffuant-Weisbuch model, which is called cautiousness. If you set that M to be 1/2, that's the standard averaging that I was talking about before. Now, you might start to be looking at this and thinking, as my intuition initially told me, that there's no like interesting difference between these two models. You might think that, well, certainly if we go long enough, we will eventually like select all the edges. Maybe we'll end up sort of more or less in the same place. And I just want to highlight that as similar as these models may seem, this difference between updating all the nodes synchronously and updating them asynchronously with this little stochastic element actually is important. And you can see this wonderful example. This is a figure that one of my students, Christina Catlett, made. You can see here, starting on the same network with the same initial data, the Hegselmann-Krause model converges to 2 opinion states, whereas the Deffuant-Weisbuch ends up with 4. And so this is all the parameters the same. So there's actually some really interesting questions, I think, as to the differences between when these models are the same and different. But I'll just finish up this section with the talk, this sort of intersection of the talk, by pointing out that there's a lot of work going on in these models. I just give here like a bullet point list of a couple of things that that I've seen out there in literature. So if any of questions, you know, if you want to say like, oh, Heather, can you do this thing? Like, yeah, so there's lots of interesting like generalizations or modifications of these models that are possible to study. I give a couple examples here on the slide, but I will direct you also to some nice reviews on the subject if you'd like to read more about what folks are thinking about. Are there, I could pause for a moment and take any quick questions about this background about bounded confidence models before I move on to the two specific projects that I've been thinking about recently.
I have a quick question.
Please, yeah.
So that distance piece that's added where you're thinking about your cutoff, is it always a distance in these models? So say, for example, you had like a really strong opinionated person that then influences a less opinionated person. So there's a directional influence. It's not truly a distance, right? It's not the same for each. Or is that typically always going to be a distance?
So I think this may partly be answered when I talk about my next project. Maybe this isn't exactly the way that you're thinking about this, but the way that I have studied maybe a similar idea is by supposing that we're working instead on a directed network. So you could say that the edges perhaps have a direction. So you could have one-way influences, right? Which is something that I do actually in the next project I'm going to talk about. You could even go, certainly I haven't done this, but I think it would be possible to think about also perhaps a weighted network where maybe certain edges have more or less strength than others. And there's a couple of folks who've thought about that kind of thing. So I think that could be another way to introduce some heterogeneity, I think, in the confidence bounds. Yeah. That's a great question. Are there other questions so far? All right. Well, if anything comes up, of course, we'll have time at the end. So, so keep thinking. For the remainder of the colloquium today, I want to talk about two recent projects that I've been involved with in the realm of bounded confidence models. And they actually mirror the two types of models that I introduced in the first half of the talk. So the first application is thinking about using Hegselmann-Krause, so synchronous, everyone updating at the same time models, to study how media impact could influence a network. And then the second project is a little bit more theoretical, a little less application driven, but it's about how we could extend bounded confidence models to include interactions beyond pairwise interactions. And that's an extension of a Deffuant-Weisbuch or asynchronous style model. So we'll get like extensions, one of each. But I will start with the media impact project. And this is joint work with Mason Porter, who's at UCLA. This was work that was out of my postdoc at UCLA, actually. So obligatory slide saying that this is an important problem. Again, not the hardest sell, sort of reminding us of where we started, why thinking about the motivation behind these models. And in particular, the pie chart on the left is some data from a 2018 Pew Research study, which suggests that over 2/3 of American adults, at least sometimes, are getting their news from social media. So thinking about the way that media outlets or news outlets are impacting folks' opinions, I think this is a very real, it's not hypothetical, right? This is certainly happening now. And so very interesting problem to try to understand the mechanisms. So again, I'm coming at this from the perspective of thinking about toy models and trying to understand how mechanisms can lead to particular outcomes. And so I have attacked this problem with thinking about essentially a little tweak, a little modification of the Hegselmann-Krause style model. So you'll notice here, similar looking abstraction to what I showed earlier, right? I have an adjacency matrix, which represents how my agents in my system are connected to each other. And in blue, I have my agents, so their opinions can be changing in time. I now have this little tweak, which I alluded to, which is you could certainly study these models on directed networks, meaning there could only be one-way influence between nodes, or if there's two edges, like between 3 and 4, then they both influence each other. So I use this structure to introduce media accounts, and the way that I define media accounts, this is very simple, and obviously a lot of, this is a big simplifying assumption, but what I assume to be true about media accounts is that they are accounts that have a fixed opinion. So that is, they don't follow any of the other accounts in the network. They don't change their opinions in time. So if you follow this literature at all, this is similar to the idea of zealots, right? These are nodes that are going to keep their opinions the same. And so we want to ask, if we have these nodes who are sort of putting whatever their opinions are out into the network, how is this going to influence or impact the network? So now, again, we need a way to think about how opinions are evolving. As I said, I take a variant of the Hegselmann-Krause model. Okay, not the most exciting slide here. The main point, you don't need to really internalize the equation other than to see, we've seen this structure before, right? This looks exactly like what I showed you earlier. So now I just have these sort of two different types of nodes, but it's all into this same kind of evolution updating rule as the Hegselmann-Krause model from before. All right, so what kind of questions can we ask once we've introduced these media nodes and this directed network structure? Well, we could ask, you know, what happens as time evolves? What does the evolution of the ideologies of each account look like in time? So here's another one of these time series, like I showed you before. Time on the horizontal axis. Each colorful line is one of my non-media nodes. And you can see how they're evolving in time as you look left to right. Now the dashed line, the thick black dashed line, that's my media account in this simulation. So it's not changing. I've just set up where the horizontal line is. And you can see that here, if I have just one media source and it's got one follower, as we would expect, this shouldn't have much of an impact on the evolution of the ideology of our model. And in fact, it doesn't. So for this particular network structure and parameter set, we see that the evolution of this model is that most of our nodes end up at sort of a moderate opinion. There's a few holdouts for structural reasons. Perhaps they don't have any neighbors that have a similar ideology, or they don't have many neighbors at all. But we don't see that. This is sort of our baseline. This is what it looks like when we have almost no media influence, let's say. So the question I wanted to ask is, what happens if I take this particular media opinion? So here I've set it to be 0.9. And what if we ramp it up? So we include perhaps more outlets with that same messaging, or alternatively, if we have more followers following those accounts, right? What's going to happen? Are we going to see impacts on the convergent state? And if so, what is it? So here's the experiments that I was doing. These are just numerical simulations of the model. On the left is what I showed you in the previous slide. In the middle, instead of one account with that ideology, I have 11 stationary media accounts. Each one has 225 followers out of a total 926. So it's quite a big ramp up. And what you see is what you might expect, which is that over time, a very large number of my non-media accounts are entraining to the media opinion. Yeah, it's not surprising, maybe. So then what I expected to see is, if I went further, right, if I add even more media accounts and even more followers per media account, always with that same ideology, well, then it should just go even faster, right? I should get maybe even more nodes, or they should get there even faster. And in fact, that's not what you see at all. You see this behavior that on the surface maybe seems quite surprising, which is that what happens is that we have a fair number of accounts that are very quickly being entrained or drawn into that media ideology, but a quite large number of other accounts that are not, that end up just, that end up elsewhere, right, at their convergent behavior. So we're actually entraining less nodes to the media ideology by ramping up this number of media accounts, which is sort of like a surprising, at least to me, it was surprising when I first saw this in the simulations. And I started asking, well, maybe this is just specific about this particular network structure. Maybe it's something about this particular parameter set. Is this robust? Is this going to happen in many realizations? And so I spent much of this paper studying that question. So in order to study that question, I need to introduce a strategy to quantify media impact, right? So I want to say, in what sense can I quantify that middle picture had more impact than that picture on the right, which had more than the picture on the left? And so we don't need to dwell like too much on the equations here, and I wouldn't stress about it. But the idea here is basically that I want to calculate some kind of mean over many realizations, and I want to do a comparison to what would happen on a particular network if I had the media and what would happen if I didn't. And so if there is a large discrepancy there, then I'm going to see a larger value. And if they're quite similar, then that'll be a smaller value. So that's the idea. We have some sort of strategy to quantify over many numerical simulations how to do this. So then if you do that, what you can do is then vary the number of followers per media account and or the number of media accounts, and do many, many trials, calculate this, see what happens. And that's the picture I'm going to show you on this next slide. This is a heat map where on the horizontal axis, I'm varying that number of followers. Vertical axis, I'm varying the number of media accounts. So here again, you want to think about that media value is just set to one fixed number. So this, when I add 20 media accounts, it's not 20 media accounts with lots of different opinions. It's 20 all with the same opinion. In this particular figure, it's 0.9. So then the colors of this heat map tell me how much impact that I have. And the arrows actually point to each of those examples I showed you on that 2 slides ago are particular realizations from different parts of this heat map. So down in the lower left, we have almost no impact rate. That's shown in the white. In the upper right, that's when we have lots of followers per media account and or lots of accounts with that opinion. That's sort of a moderate amount of impact. And then in the middle, this is where it gets really exciting, right? In the middle, we have this this beautiful band of the darkest red, the highest impact according to our statistic. And that's representing that middle figure I showed you a few slides ago. So I was really excited to start to see, to be able to like visualize this structure. And then once I've got this set up, I can vary all sorts of things and see how robust this sort of sweet spot region is. And so for details on how we do this, I would invite you to look at the paper. I'll just I'm going to flash a bunch of pictures at you now. So for example, I took a bunch of real networks. So these are actually Facebook networks, Facebook friendships from 2005, back when Facebook was only at colleges. And so thinking about like how the friendship networks from different colleges, these are all real social networks, and they all have this same, if I run my model on these networks, they all have this same sort of sweet spot phenomenon. But you might think like, well, that's sort of particular type of network maybe. So we do look at some other synthetic networks as well. And we see to like varying degrees that we'll see these qualitative dynamics show up in a variety of synthetic networks as well. We can look at how this sort of sweet spot behavior is enhanced or decreased depending on different network parameters. So network size, the mean number of friends or follows a non-media account has, so sort of the connectivity of the network, thinking about that receptiveness parameter. And you can see, again, more details in the paper, but just showing you that there's This is a fairly robust phenomenon, and it's something that's can be modified by network structure and by model parameters. So I will leave it there for that project. Just to summarize, we developed a model to study media impact, and that's based on the classical Hegselmann-Krause style model. Found this interesting sweet spot, which does depend on the network features. So you can sort of modify this either by thinking about modifying the amount of media in your network and or by modifying the network itself, right? We had a variety of other things, like we tried this on some, we tried like varying the sort of media, thinking about incorporating media quality. There's a variety of other things we've thought about, which I'll invite you to visit the paper if you're interested. But instead of going into more details there, I wanted to save some time to talk about like most recent, I would say hot off the presses, but it's not even, it's in presses work, which is on thinking about generalizing these models for hypergraphs. And for, in terms of applications, that means thinking about interactions beyond pairwise interactions, some group interactions. This is joint work with some folks out of UCLA as well. This was really spearheaded by Abby Hickok, who's a really awesome graduate student. So I want to give her a particular shout out on her great work on this project. So the idea behind this project is that one limitation of the models that I've been talking about up to this point is that we're assuming that the interactions are only happening pairwise. Whereas in reality, we know this may not be the case, right? We may sit down with 2 or 3 friends over coffee, right? We might be in a group chat or an email chain, which has many people on it, right? And how could we start to model those type of interactions? And we have this really cool mathematical structure that actually can help us with this, right? We call interactions beyond pairwise interactions, so higher order interactions, we call them polyadic. So interactions between perhaps more than 2 nodes in our network. We could represent those with this object called the hypergraph. So on the left is the standard graph, which you've been thinking about so far. The edges come out of the set V cross V, right? Just pairwise. A hypergraph is a generalization where we still have our vertex set, but then our edge set is a subset of the power set of the vertices. So you can have, certainly you could still have pairs of nodes in an edge, like in E1, that's like our standard kind of pairwise interaction, but you could have 3 nodes like I have in HyperEdge 2, E2 there, or 4 nodes, right, as in E3, up to, you know, all of them if you like. So that's the structure of the hypergraph. And what me and my collaborators wanted to ask is, how could we extend these bounded confidence models to the hypergraph setting? And is there any interesting dynamics that happen there that don't happen in the standard graph setting? So for the purposes of this paper, we decided we wanted to extend this Deffuant-Weisbuch, this asynchronous model for bounded confidence. And so here's how we decided to develop this, how we decided to write this down. So in the Deffuant-Weisbuch model, you select an edge at each time step at random according to some probability distribution. So our generalization is like sort of like do the obvious thing. Let's select a hyperedge at random. And then for every node that's in that hyperedge, what we're going to do is either update them all to the mean of their opinions if they are sufficiently close in a way that remains to be defined. And if they are not sufficiently close, then they're just going to remain as they are. And then we carry on, select another hyperedge. Okay, so it's like exactly the same as the Deffuant-Weisbuch model, except it still remains, how do we define if they're sufficiently close, right? We can't just do that sort of pairwise distance. So what we did is we extended this to develop what we call the discordance function. You can see the definition on the slide. It's basically saying compare each node in the hyperedge to the mean. We take the sum of those squared differences, and then we use that value to compare it to our cutoff. So if you're really paying attention, you might notice that this does not exactly reduce, like this is a little bit different than if we just had a 2-node edge. It doesn't exactly reduce the Deffuant-Weisbuch case. It's a little bit of a modification in terms of what the C is, but you can change the C so that you can get exactly that specific example of the standard graph model. So a little bit of subtlety there. We did this just for reasons of convenience in the proofs, basically, but there's the mapping between them. So anyway, what we can observe with this setup, with this discordance function and the hypergraph, is that right away you could construct examples where there's sort of interesting things that happen. So for example, if you think about the green hyperedge that just includes 2 nodes, perhaps we set our C to be 0.5, then a node with opinion 0 and a node with opinion 1, they will not interact. There will be no update. However, if we introduce instead a different hyperedge that contains 3 nodes, those 2 plus a node whose opinion is sort of in between them, we have what we like to think about as a mediator effect. So what happens is actually the discordance of these 3 nodes because of this mediator is less. And this mediator actually can induce an update that would not happen in the pairwise version. So it's kind of like already exciting to see some differences that you don't see in the standard graph case. What we wanted to do for this paper is to try to start to get at extending some of the results that exist in the classical graph literature. And so we mostly focus on those questions I brought up at the beginning of the talk: convergence, consensus. So the question of convergence, the first thing you might want to ask is, does this model have nice convergence behavior? Do we expect we're always going to converge to a stationary state? And the answer is yes, we converge almost surely for any initial opinion state, which is great news. So that's in analogy with the standard Deffuant-Weisbuch model. We have a partial characterization of convergence time. So then the question, does it converge in finite time? This is as I said, it's not complete, but we do have some understanding of what's going on. So it turns out this model converges in finite time if we have a complete hypergraph, which means that all of the possible hyperedges that you have exist. This actually is in contrast with the Deffuant-Weisbuch model is not guaranteed to converge in finite time. It's guaranteed to converge almost surely as t goes to infinity. So actually a little bit of improvement for some cases. However, in general, we have some counterexamples where we know we don't have to converge in finite time, although we do converge. And there's an interesting feature where there is a phase transition in convergence time depending on the variance in the initial opinions. And that's what's pictured on the right. So if the variance of the initial opinions is quite large, then the convergence time grows at least exponentially, which is super important to know if you're doing simulations of these models. Like, you need to be quite careful about how long you simulate these models, because it may take longer to converge than you might expect depending on your variance. So we also tried to look at some consensus results. We have a few interesting theorems along this realm as well. So first I'll look at that case of complete hypergraphs, so very special case. What we can show is that if we have this hypergraph, so something that contains all the possible hyperedges, as long as our initial opinions are bounded, then we will converge to consensus almost surely, as long as we satisfy the condition that you see in the theorem there. It's a little bit messy, but all you need to know is you can sort of see that as the number of agents gets larger, it's easier to converge to consensus. As your C gets larger, it's easier to converge to consensus. As your initial opinion bounds decrease, it's easier to converge to consensus. And there's an example of simulation of this converging to consensus. So this is actually consensus in a wider class than we would expect in the standard graph models. So we thought this is quite interesting. It seems like consensus is a little bit easier, potentially because of this mediator effect. Again, in these particular complete hypergraphs. We can relax this a little bit actually and look at hypergraphs where there is a hyperedge that contains all the nodes. And then we also have a fairly strong consensus result for that class of hypergraphs as well. It turns out that the probability of reaching consensus, if we have such a hypergraph, approaches 1 as the number of nodes get large. So another case where it's really easy to reach consensus if you have an edge that contains all the nodes. There are some specific conditions on this about the variance of the initial opinions. We think that condition is maybe stricter than it needs to be, but for the purposes of the theorem we have, that's what we've got at the moment. The last thing I want to mention is moving away from the sort of classical convergence and consensus results of this model is thinking about what makes the hypergraph model different than the standard graph models. And there's one really exciting phenomenon which we observe in the hypergraph model that can't happen in the standard graph model, which is that we see this phenomenon that we call opinion jumping. So it's actually possible, because of the way this discordance works, that a node could move further than the distance of that threshold value C. So you can see this represented in these two simulations by these very large vertical lines. That represents like quite a large jump. Here the threshold value is 1 for C. So the discordance of the entire hyperedge should be less than 1 in order to induce an update. However, it turns out that there are specific nodes that can move greater than that distance 1 in opinion space in these hypergraph models, which couldn't happen in the standard one. So this could be one possible mechanism for how, why it is more easy to reach consensus in the hypergraph models than it is in the standard graph models. So this has been a really cool project. As I said, it's definitely more on the theoretical side at this stage, but it is the first hypergraph model of bounded confidence, which we're excited about. And we've done, I think, some really nice characterizations, but actually there's a lot that's still open. So if you're excited about this kind of thing, if you like working on hypergraphs, lots of open questions about, convergence times, about the effects of parameters and structure in these models, conditions for this opinion jumping. We only have sort of partial characterizations on that. So loads of open questions that I will just tell you are out there. So it should be a lot of exciting work to do in the future. But with that, I'm gonna conclude. I think we're basically out of time. So just big thanks to my collaborators on these two projects who are at UCLA and Caltech. I want to shout out I have some really wonderful students here at Harvey Mudd who are working on a variety of projects. Many of them are sort of opinion dynamics related. And I appreciate you all so much for coming today, for listening, being a great audience. And I am happy to take any questions. As we take questions, I'll put up this references slide. So if you want to read any more about either background or the two papers I talked about today, please do so. Thanks so much for listening.
Can we thank our speaker? All right. So does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question, Heather. I think I enjoyed your talk. I think it's really interesting material. In this, when I think about like my social media, contacts, I'm assuming that all my connections are not equally likely to for me to see them. Like I think that some, I'm sort of prioritized where I'm going to probably see the same people's opinion or posts more often than others. Is that, and so that's, I guess it seems like when you had the one model where it was like there was people were selected to interact and then you saw how their opinion changed. If that probability is, not uniform based on maybe their own initial proximity to my opinion, does that, are uneven probabilities, have you looked at that, and how do you think that would work out if you haven't looked at it yet?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question, Ross. So I personally haven't looked at this, but totally something that you could introduce. I have to say all the work that I have done on like the hypergraphs and so on Deffuant-Weisbuch style models, we've assumed that the probability distribution for drawing edges is uniform. However, you're totally right that I think a big consideration about the way that opinions are being spread, like in real life on the internet, is that all of our social media feeds are being given to us algorithmically, right? They're not, we don't see everything. So I think it would be really interesting, and I certainly haven't done it, but it'd be great to think about introducing a different sort of probability distribution that could somehow capture some of those algorithmic strategies for whose opinion you see. But yeah, haven't done it. That's a great question. Other questions?
I'll ask a question. The getting news from social media sources, I'm assuming that this is maybe self-reported, that people say that they get news from there, or is it based on collected data from somewhere where it's based on clicks and views?
Yeah, so that from that like pie chart that I was showing, is that what you're asking about, Eric?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was a survey. So these are self-reported. That was a Pew Research survey. I don't know. So I think the problem with, you could certainly look at clicks and views, like you could do that study, but the challenge is that you wouldn't capture those people who aren't on social media, right? With that strategy. I don't know if people have done such a study, but yeah, in that case, it was a survey, self-reported. Yeah, good question, thanks.
I have lots of questions, but I don't want to take up the rest of the time that people have to ask other questions. So I'm going to wait.
And also, if you think of something you want to ask later, pops into your head, at a future date, anyone here, feel free to email me. And yeah, you can get in touch with me.
I don't know whether Thomas will be able to chime in and ask his questions about Utah or not. His mic wasn't working.
Right, yeah, I certainly invited Thomas to follow up with me. I've got my email there. That's probably the best way to contact me. So super happy to chat about that at a time when it's working, or like other folks who want to chat, also extend that invitation.
Is my mic working now?
I hear you. Yeah, I hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Did you say you put your email in the chat?
I can put it in the chat. It is on the screen, but let me go ahead and put it in the chat. Then you can sort of copy and paste.
I'll screenshot it real quick. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.